Okay, everyone, in this session 14, we are in chapter 17 of our journey through the Acts of the Apostles. And as I promised last week, I'm doing this week and last week a parallel character study. And tonight I'd like to look at Paul's journey, his first steps into Europe, meeting Luke, Lydia, Priscilla, and Aquila. Now, in Paul's second missionary journey, he is in the region of southern Turkey today. And all of a sudden, he makes a beeline for Troas, up to the north. And you wonder why this change of course? And it's fascinating to know this because Paul has an illness. And we can discover this in the letter to the Galatians. And we can guess that his problem is actually an eye problem. Because he says to them, "You would have torn out your own eyes and given them to me." And also we can see in Galatians chapter 6, verse 11, "See what large letters I use as I write to you with my own hand." So Paul's writing is large because of his eye problems. And we can see with Galatians as well that it was very unpleasant to see, because he said, "I looked really bad and you didn't treat me with contempt." So visibly he would get a fever, they get infected, and his eyes would swell, and there was, the consequences of that. So what happens here is that they hear there's a very good doctor in a place called Troas, way up in the north of Turkey, which would have been Troy, near Troy, the famous Troy. And Paul goes up there, and that doctor is actually Luke. And once they're in Troas, Paul gets medical treatment from Luke, and Luke will be with him right to his death, 18 years later. "Only Dr. Luke is with me," says Paul in his prison in Rome. And while they're in Troas, Paul has a vision to go to Greece, to go to Macedonia, a vision of the people of Macedonia begging him to come over and to be with them. And we see here as well that Luke, who's narrating the Acts of the Apostles, changes pronouns. Up to now, in chapter 16, verse 6, it's they, and all of a sudden it's we when they go into Greece. Okay? So the very first town they hit there is Philippi, and it's a Roman colony. There's visibly no synagogue there, so it means there wasn't even 10 Jewish men there, because you need 10 Jewish men, a minyan, to make one synagogue. And he stays there for several days. And they go down to the river to see if there's any Jewish people praying, and that's where he meets Lydia for the first time. And Lydia is touched by the words of Paul and the grace of the Holy Spirit, and she converts. And she's the very first convert of Europe. For me, she's like a patron saint of Europe. And Paul meets her for the first time. She was a dealer in purple cloth from the city of Thyatira in Turkey. So she was running a business back and forth from Turkey to Greece. And I really like Lydia. She's definitely one of my favorites. And she's a very different person than most women you meet in the Bible. So she's a dealer in purple cloth from the city of Thyatira, from the book of Revelation, modern day Turkey. It's one of the 7 churches of the book of Revelation. And what's she doing in Philippi? Her hometown was back in Turkey, but she was making a business for the Roman soldiers who wore purple. So she was getting a lot of money from that. So she was a very successful businesswoman in her own right. She exports these purple cloth that's made from a snail, a mollusk that's crushed, and a crimson dye flows from it. And she had a large and beautiful home in Philippi, from where she runs her business. So she was quite a woman. She was very independent. Nothing is said about a husband, apparently. She's not married. It's never mentioned. And she's with other women down by the river. So she's quite a successful businesswoman in her own right. So Paul, Silas, Timothy, and Luke become guests in her house in Philippi, and they stay there for several weeks. So she's a very likable personality, and she is the bridge between Asia and Europe. She is the first convert, and she is a huge source of support and income and protection for Paul and his disciples in their ministry in Greece. And the last people I want to mention here is Aquila and Priscilla. Now, Priscilla and Aquila are mentioned 6 times, and they were really good friends of Paul and great support for him. And first of all, it's interesting that the woman is mentioned first. In most of the times they're mentioned in the New Testament, Priscilla is mentioned and then Aquila. And they were tent makers. So her name being mentioned means first is that she was probably of social status higher than her husband, and also probably a very strong personality. So Paul is in Athens, and it wasn't easy to evangelize Athens. The philosophers kind of scoffed at Paul. So Paul goes down to Corinth, and Corinth was one of the biggest ports in the whole world at that time. And he arrives in Corinth, and he's walking down into the marketplace, and Paul is a tent maker, because Jewish people had to learn a trade, that no matter how intellectual they were, because Paul was a great intellectual, they always had to have a trade to fall back on, because whenever times got tough. And as a friend of mine says, who's a barber, he said, I learned the trade of barbering because I knew that everybody needs a haircut. And no matter what job I'd get, if I ever lost that job or times got tough, you can always be sure people will need a haircut. So Paul is walking in the marketplace, and he steps into the tent makers, Priscilla and Aquila, and says, hey, I'm a tent maker too. Have you got this machine, that machine? Do you make this and that? And they knew straight away they were dealing with somebody who knew what it was to make tents. And so they strike up a friendship. Now, Priscilla and Aquila were already Christians who had fled the persecution in Rome. And they became great evangelizers. Actually, Apollos was converted by Aquila and Priscilla. And Paul deliberately was a tent maker because obviously he made a bit of money and income, but also making tents in the marketplace was a huge place of evangelization. And so Paul, Priscilla, and Aquila worked really strongly in Corinth just by making tents all day, and people coming in and out of the shop and meeting people and evangelizing through their workplace. They converted and touched a lot of hearts. And finally, in Romans 16, verse 4, we read that they laid down their life for Paul. So in Romans 16, we see that Paul writes to them and says, thank you for sticking your neck out for me. He says, doesn't say necks, he says singular, neck. So Priscilla and Aquila loved Paul and sacrificed a lot for him, and even went to the point of almost dying for him. We don't know what the circumstances is, but they saved Paul's life one time when he was in trouble. So there you go. You have Paul's journey into Europe, meeting Luke, the great person of Lydia, and the central role of these strong, independent, professional women who supported and gave friendship to Paul and gave him support in his ministry.